Good evening and welcome to the National Churchill Library and Center. My name is Michael Bishop and I'm the director of the library and the executive director of the International Churchill Society. The NCLC is a partnership between the university and the society, and over the last 2 years we've welcomed many students and visitors and shared with them access to primary documents, books, and exhibits about Winston Churchill, which I hope you'll take some time to enjoy this evening. To learn more about Churchill and the work of the Society, please visit winstonchurchill.org. We have welcomed to the library leaders such as David Rubenstein, General David Petraeus, former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, former British Foreign Secretary Lord Owen, and actor Gary Oldman, novelist Robert Harris, and many, many others, to discuss not only the particulars of Churchill's life and career, but their application to our present-day challenges. For as Churchill himself observed, the longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward. The NCLC is about a study not just of a figure from the past, but of leadership. That's how we fit in here at the George Washington University. And I'm very happy to welcome tonight Geneva Henry, the Dean of Libraries and Academic Innovation, and my boss. Tonight, we're particularly honored to welcome His Excellency Ron Dermer, Ambassador of Israel to the United States. Ambassador Dermer was born and raised in Miami Beach, Florida, very fun place. He earned a degree in Finance and Management from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and a degree in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, PPE, the degree of Prime Ministers, from Oxford University. For 3 years, he was a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. In 2004, the ambassador co-authored with Natan Sharansky the best-selling book, The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror, which has been translated into 10 languages. From 2005 to 2008, he served as Israel's Minister of Economic Affairs in the United States. And from 2009 to 2013, he served as Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Welcome, Ambassador Dermer. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I have to tell you, this is by far the most comfortable chair I've sat in 5 years as ambassador. So I don't really care how long this evening is going to go.
Good. Okay.
I don't. It looks actually more. It actually feels more comfortable than it looks.
Yeah, it is actually pretty nice. But we got a very good deal, Geneva. Don't.
Can we get one of these in the office? It's good for the spineless diplomats. This is great.
There you go. So your boss and friend, the Prime Minister, and you were both ardent admirers of Winston Churchill. And I thought we'd start by exploring really the principal reasons for that admiration, and maybe more specifically, how Churchill and his example have helped shape your own statesmanship.
Well, the Prime Minister, I would see, obviously, I feel he's a friend, but he's really a mentor to me for many years, and Natan Sharansky, who I wrote this book on democracy with. But why I see Churchill as such a unique figure, and I think it's the same reason the Prime Minister does, because he had the two qualities most essential for leadership and most essential for statesmanship. The virtue of the statesman, Jabotinsky, who was also a great statesman before Israel was established, a real great Zionist in the history of the Zionist movement, said the virtue of the statesman is prescience. So the ability to see dangers ahead. And obviously Churchill had that in what everyone knows, his standing alone in those critical years in the 30s and recognizing the danger of the Nazis when everyone else was prepared to sort of sweep it under the rug. But he also had the second important quality of statesmanship and real leadership is courage. And we were just speaking before, there's a difference between physical courage on the battlefield, which people have. That doesn't necessarily translate into political courage, which is the ability to take stances that are not popular at the time. And sometimes those two things go together, because if you see what others do not see, if you see dangers that others do not see, then you will actually find yourself standing up to those dangers at a time when your colleagues, not only the opposition, but your colleagues could attack you because they don't recognize the same threats that you recognize. And I think that's the reason why, at least that's the reason I admire him. It's interesting, the Prime Minister, I don't know if there's a leader around the world who admires Churchill more than Prime Minister Netanyahu. He is somebody who does not have a me wall in his office. You know what the me wall is, where it's pictures of everybody who you've met. And so a lot of times you'll walk into people's offices and they have pictures of them with all sorts of leaders. So Netanyahu does not have pictures with leaders, other leaders in his office. He has pictures, two pictures behind his desk. The first one is of Theodor Herzl, who was the visionary of modern Zionism, who had this idea that the Jews, wasn't the first person to have the idea that the Jews should establish a state in our ancestral homeland, but he was the one who gave modern Zionism meaning by turning this idea, nebulous idea and aspiration, which has been there for centuries, giving it a real plan of action. So that's the Herzl. And the second is Churchill, who's behind his desk. And I think it's because Churchill was someone who saw the gathering storms when few others did. And it wasn't just the Nazis, he also recognized the dangers that communism was going to pose to the world at a time when no one wanted to listen to that. And he gave his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. And by the way, that's my personal connection to Churchill, not only because I spoke in Fulton, Missouri earlier this year about Churchill and Israel, it's also because I was born and raised in Miami Beach. And we have not left in Miami Beach such a huge imprint on intellectual history. I'm being diplomatic about that. Virtually no imprint whatsoever. But it is true for you Churchill buffs that Churchill wrote that Iron Curtain speech while on vacation in Miami Beach, Florida. So we feel very proud about that in Miami Beach, natives of Miami. But he saw these dangers ahead. He saw the gathering storms. And Israel is a place where there are a lot of storms around us. And in fact, for the last decade in which the Prime Minister has been Prime Minister, he's sort of been in the eye of the storm when you see all of these changes happening around us. And I think Churchill is somebody who inspires him to see clearly those dangers and to confront those dangers in time. That's the hardest thing to do. The hardest thing for a statesman to do and for a leader to do is to take action against a danger that no one else sees. And you had in the case of the Prime Minister, the clearest example of that was Iran and the nuclear deal with Iran, where he came here 3 years ago to the United States and spoke in Congress against a deal that he regarded, and I regard as well, as a threat to not only the security of Israel, but to the survival of Israel. Now, that wasn't a hugely popular position at the time. The Prime Minister was alone among world leaders in openly opposing the nuclear deal with Iran. So think about that. There's almost 200 countries around the world, and one leader was prepared to stand alone. And I think having an example like Churchill, who was pretty much alone also during those wilderness years, I actually think in one sense what Netanyahu did was more remarkable. And I'll tell you why. Because Churchill was in the opposition. He was not in power when he had to do it. What he did when he was in power in Great Britain, he had to rally the country to confront that danger at very, very late in the game. We'd say the 90th minute, but people don't understand soccer here. So we'll say, with 2 minutes to go in the game, he had to rally his people to stand up to the Nazis. And in doing so, he not only saves England, arguably he saves Western civilization, because things could have gone very different had they made a quick peace, or tried to make a quick peace with a regime, the Nazi regime, that you couldn't have made peace with. What is remarkable about what Netanyahu did is that he stood alone when he was in power and when he had everything to lose. And I have great admiration for his political courage in doing that, and also for recognizing those dangers in time. But those are the reasons why I think he admires, the Prime Minister admires Churchill, and certainly why I admire him.
I'd like to circle back to the Iran deal shortly, but first I wanted to talk to you about Churchill's role in the history of Israel. He famously planted a tree on what would become the campus of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1921. And as he was doing it, he gave a little speech, and he said, "My heart is full of sympathy for Zionism." And he would maintain that sympathy over the very turbulent decades to come. A couple of years, or a year after the founding He said, "The coming into being of a Jewish state in Palestine is an event in world history to be viewed in the perspective not of a generation or a century, but in the perspective of 1,000, 2,000, or even 3,000 years." Can you share with us your insights into Churchill's role in Israeli
Yeah, it's hard to
history?
top that, a Churchill quote, but Churchill was a philo-Semite. And those of you who don't know what a philo-Semite is, because it's a word that's not usually used, it's the opposite of an anti-Semite, meaning he had a great love and sympathy for the Jewish people from a very, very young age. Now, the cynics who look at why Churchill supported Jews and supported Zionism and ultimately supported Israel, even though he wasn't prime minister at the time that Israel was established. The cynics will say it's because he had Jewish friends and they were his supporters during the war and they gave him money and things like that, but I think those people don't understand who Churchill was, and it really goes back to something I think inculcated in him by his father, whose father would socialize with Jews at a time in British history where the British aristocracy would not do that. And his father's political mentor was Benjamin Disraeli. And he had a big impact on Churchill's father, and Churchill was enamored with his father and therefore was enamored with the people who his father was enamored with. And Disraeli is a very interesting figure. He was born Jewish, and he converted to Christianity. And what was different about Disraeli, and I think he was very clever in this as well, a lot of people who converted out of Judaism historically turned their back on the Jews and actually denigrated the Jews. And they said, we have nothing to do with them, and they're terrible people, and a lot of the horrible things that have been said about Jews have been said by Jews who left Judaism and went to Christianity. But Disraeli was smart enough to understand that in 19th century Britain, the more he would cast the Jews in a negative light, the more he ultimately would be seen as a negative light, because that was his history and that was his tradition, even though he had converted religions. And Disraeli saw the Jews as a great people, as a heroic people that had survived despite all these odds century after century. And he, I think, translated that sense, that heroic sense of the Jews to Churchill's father, who then translated it to him. And there was this philosophy that would be very common among evangelicals today from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, is I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So Disraeli had a slightly different take on it, which was the Lord treats the nations as the nations treat the Jews. And I think from a very young age, Churchill saw the Jews as a people with a glorious past, but also who could have a brilliant future. And just as Churchill, I think, recognized threats to civilization, everybody knows that, the Nazis, the communists, he also recognized those who he thought were partners in building civilization. And he saw the Jews as a partner in building civilization. And he stood up to anti-Semitism from a very young age in politics. He stood it up. There was an aliens bill in the early 20th century where Jews were fleeing pogroms in Russia. And he even stood up to his own party in that. And it wasn't just because he had a Jewish constituency. Even when he changed constituency, he was pretty consistent in his position. He supported Emile Zola, those of you who know the history of anti-Semitism in the Dreyfus Affair, where he pushed back against that as well at a time when it wasn't popular to take that stance. And Jews in England, British Jewry, were very supportive of Churchill well before 1921, when he became the colonial secretary and planted that tree. But I think his view of Zionism and the possible benefits of Zionism actually stemmed from this very, very philo-Semitic attitude of the Jews. He said, this is a people that were great once, can be great again, and if they can go and reconstitute their national life in their homeland, their historic homeland, they could contribute greatly, not just to the Jews who live here, not just to Great Britain, but to the entire world. And he said many things of that, even when he planted that tree and he gave this famous speech. So when he becomes colonial secretary in 1921, you have in Churchill somebody who supported the idea of a Jewish national home that was first made official by Britain in the Balfour Declaration. People don't know that Churchill was in that government, in Balfour's government, but he was supportive a decade before with the idea of the Jews going and rebuilding their national home, and he was entrusted with this position of being colonial secretary. And when he got there in 1921, it was after World War I, when much of the British leadership was prepared to reject and turn their back on the Balfour Declaration. Now, the only reason why the British got the mandate over Palestine by the League of Nations was because of the Balfour Declaration. So they were entrusted with the mandate in order to enact the promise or to fulfill the promise of the Balfour Declaration by enabling the Jews to reconstitute their national home. But when he arrived in the land of Israel, then what was called Palestine in 1921, the Arabs there wanted him to abandon that commitment. And he refused to do so. He said, I don't have the power to do it, and if I have the power, I don't have the will to do it because I believe in this. And I think what he saw in 1921 convinced him even more about the promise that Zionism posed, not just, as I said, to Jews and to Brits, but even to all the inhabitants. Now, you look 100 years later, and I think he was right. But he was a steadfast friend. There's a famous, one of Churchill's most famous speeches was in 1922, in the House of Commons, when the House of Lords had already turned against Balfour. It didn't take long for Britain to turn against its commitment that it made in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration in the heat of the war. They turned their back 5 years later. The House of Lords, I think by about two-thirds, had rejected the Balfour Declaration, and it fell to the House of Commons. And in the House of Commons, Churchill rises up and he defends Zionism and defends British commitment to Zionism, and he sort of saved the day. Unfortunately, he would lose power for other reasons, and as he goes into the wilderness years, all those forces within Britain that wanted to turn their back against Zionism became stronger and stronger. And just as they were appeasing the Germans in Europe, there was also an appeasement policy towards the Arabs of the Middle East. And so this commitment that Britain had towards Zionism, there was a big shift that happened when Churchill was out of power. And in 1939, there was, the British issued a white paper, which the Jews referred to as a black paper, because it essentially stopped Jewish immigration into Palestine. It allowed some immigration for 5 years, and then it called for a complete halt. And it's, I don't think, a coincidence that the person who submitted the so-called black paper was Chamberlain. He was the one who stood behind it. And his biggest opponent was Churchill. And Churchill rose up and he said that this is it's like a second Munich, and don't do this. Unfortunately, he didn't win the day there. And then he became prime minister in 1940, in May of 1940, and when he did, they were celebrating in Tel Aviv. There's a story of a teacher going into a classroom in Tel Aviv and announcing that Churchill has become prime minister of Great Britain, and the students breaking out into applause, which shows you, even before he was prime minister, how much he was seen as a friend. And then you have the period of Churchill during the war. That's a much more complicated period because of the Holocaust. And I don't think we should sort of whitewash that period. But Churchill was extremely sympathetic to the Jews. I think if he had the power, he would have taken much more forceful action. But he was not surrounded by a government of philo-Semites. Let me be diplomatic about that. There were real anti-Semites within his government, and his focus was on winning the war, not saving the Jews.
Yeah.
And that was his main focus. And by the way, if you don't understand why you need to have an Israel, it's because Israel is the one place where winning a war and saving the Jews is the same thing. And unfortunately, at that time, you not only had the Jews being subjected to a Holocaust in Europe, the gates of then Palestine were closed to them because of this black paper, because of this effort to appease the Arabs at the time. And so the Jews were really trapped. They had no place to go, and the United States was certainly no better at the time. And let's just say that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great president in many ways. He was not a friend of the Jews. He never was a friend of the Jews, and he was not a friend of Israel. He didn't believe in this idea of a Jewish state. And so during the war, Churchill did try to do things to save Jews, but he was not able to, he didn't put this black paper, he didn't enforce it, but he also didn't reverse it. And he believed that he would deal with the issue of a Jewish state after the war in a peace conference. And he was convinced that he was going to sit down with Ibn Saud, the leader of Saudi Arabia, and him and Roosevelt and a couple of other people, and they'd figure out how to solve this problem, because he genuinely believed that Israel would be a great gift to the whole region as well, and they would prosper from this as well, and that everyone should support it. But of course, the peace conference never came because Churchill tells you something about how people value leadership. He was thrown out of office in between victory in Europe and victory in the Pacific. He was thrown out of office, so he was never there. And in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, Churchill was not Prime Minister of Britain. Had he been Prime Minister, I would bet that he would have beaten Truman to the punch. Truman took all of 11 minutes to recognize the newly established state of Israel. I bet you Churchill would have gone into the single digits. And it was months before Britain recognized the newly established state of Israel. And one of the people, I think, in Parliament that triggered that change was Churchill, who rose up and said that quote that you just said now, that he basically rose up like a Gulliver against the Laputians, and he said, you guys don't understand. This event, the establishment of Israel, is an event of historical magnitude, not for a generation, but 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000 years. And a few days later, the British government decided to recognize Israel, and Chaim Weizmann, who had once said he was Israel's first president, he once said during World War II that Israel only had one friend, that Jews only had one friend in the British government. It happened to be the Prime Minister, but that was their only friend. He sends Churchill a letter after the speech that he gave in Parliament calling on the government. He was the head of the opposition, calling on the government to recognize Israel, the state of Israel, and he sends him this very note thanking him. And Churchill, I think, signed a letter back to Weizmann, and he said, and the light grows. I think those were the exact words that he used, because he believed in this promise of Israel. And I think if Churchill would come back today and would see the country that Israel has become, he would understand that the light has grown very, very big and not just has done wonders for its own inhabitants, but wonders for the entire world. That's a short answer to a very long question.
That was a very good answer. Churchill was half American, and he rightly saw the United States as critical to winning the Second World War. And even in his second term as Prime Minister, at the very end of it, during his last cabinet meeting, he turned around to his colleagues and he said, never be separated from the Americans. Israel has a very special relationship with the United States. It's had its vicissitudes over time. I wonder, could you reflect on the special relationship between Israel and the United States and comment on its current status?
Well, that's good advice that Churchill gave, to not be separated from the Americans. It's definitely good to have the world's greatest power on your side. And he was keenly aware of it and knew that when America entered the war that ultimately that Britain would be saved and the tide would ultimately turn. Israel, like Britain, has a special, unique relationship with the United States. Some people think this relationship has been a strategic relationship from the beginning, but that is actually not true. Even though Truman recognized the state of Israel within 11 minutes, Truman's administration also slapped an arms embargo on Israel. So Israel was literally fighting for its life against 5 invading Arab armies, and while our enemies were actually getting arms supplied to them, the United States would not give Israel arms at the time. And there's all sorts of people, Americans, who helped Israel during that time, smuggling arms to get to Israel to help the fledgling state survive. So it is not right to think that the relationship that Israel has with the United States today was always there. What you had was moral support by President Truman and by other leaders, and you had moral support by different figures in Congress, but there was no strategic relationship between Israel and the United States. And certainly our contribution to the relationship would be minuscule, and we were not getting that much from the United States in those early years, really the first 2 decades. What changed was when Israel proved itself to be a formidable, reliable ally on the battlefield. In 1967, when we won the Six-Day War, which many people thought we were going to lose. And then 1973, when we repelled aggression against us during the Yom Kippur War under very difficult circumstances from both Egypt and Syria, we sort of turned the tide and won the war. And then what had happened was Israel that was seen as an ally of the United States had defeated countries that were being armed by the Soviets. So in the Cold War politics of the time, Israel was seen as an important ally in that fight. And the United States, as countries do, they invested in a winner. And Israel proved itself a winner. And so then they increased assistance to Israel. The major monetary assistance, military assistance that Israel got actually came in the wake of the peace agreement that we signed with Egypt. Because in that peace agreement, we not only got peace, but we also had to give something up. And we gave back territory, the Sinai, in between, at that point it was in between Israel today and Egypt. But we gave back the Sinai, which is 3 times the size of the state of Israel. So it's a huge amount of territory, and it also has huge, I know that's a good word, huge, capital letters. And it also would have made Israel, I think, self-sufficient in terms of its energy needs. So Israel made a great compromise for peace, and in order to ensure that Israel would come out of a peace agreement even stronger than it was before, that's how you have the military assistance that we've been blessed to have from the United States since really the late 70s. Now, I think you went from this moral support to sort of a strategic support. Now I think you have something else. And it really changed, I think, after 9/11, when there was a common battle, a struggle against the forces of militant Islam and terrorism. And Israel becomes a very, very important ally in the most dangerous region in the world. And today I would argue that our alliance, I believe Israel will be, and is becoming actually, the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century. Now that's a big statement to make because Israel's a country all the size of New Jersey with 9 million people in it. So how could that be the most important ally? And the most important ally of the United States in the 20th century was definitely Great Britain. There's no question about it. But here's why I think that Israel is going to be the most important ally. And we're in this process. And sometimes when people focus on the disagreements between governments, like the disagreement that we had with the previous administration over the nuclear deal with Iran, they lose sight over the tectonic plates that are shifting the two countries together. And when I say that I think Israel is going to be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century, that's not something I say now because we agree with the current administration on the Iran issue. It's something I said 5 years ago in the first speech I gave as an ambassador on Independence Day when we disagreed with the previous administration. But the reason why we're, I think, the most important ally is because, for 2 reasons, security and technology. First, in security, I think for the foreseeable future, the greatest threats, the threats that the United States faces will unfortunately emanate from the Middle East for decades to come. I know a lot of people want to pivot to Asia, but the Middle East is not pivoting away from you. And I think that these threats will be acute, and I think to the extent that you don't want to be here, be there, I should say, in the Middle East, I think Israel becomes more important, not less important. And one thing that seems to unite people across the political spectrum in the United States is that no one is looking to send thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops to the Middle East to fight wars. Well, if you don't want to be there, you need a solid, reliable, democratic, dependable ally in the region. And that's why I think Israel grows as an important power. The other thing is in terms of security, is our intelligence capabilities. I mean, Israel, I'll be diplomatic because I'm in the United States, we have one of the best intelligence agencies in the world. And you saw some pretty remarkable things that happened recently. Those of you who saw the Prime Minister a few months ago talk about this nuclear archive, this secret atomic archive from the heart of Tehran. I mean, this is the stuff of novels. But Israel's intelligence agencies have foiled some 24 major terrorist attacks, 24 in the last few years. And these are terrorist attacks that could claim the lives of hundreds of people all over the world. And it's because we have this really formidable intelligence agency and we have tremendous intelligence cooperation. So security is one pillar. And if you think to yourself, who's our most important security partner in the world? So, you know, Britain's there. It's up there. You say France is an important partner. You say Australia is an important partner. You say Germany's an important partner. You say Canada's important. There's a handful of them that are up there. But I think in terms of where the dangers are, Israel's the only one that partner. That's number one. Number two is Israel is a global technological power. Not a local or regional technological power, a global technological power. So in agriculture, in water, in cyber, So here, just to give you the extent of Israel's power in cyber, we are about, as I said, fewer than 9 million people in Israel. So we account for about 0.1% of the world's population. So the last 2 years, Israel accounted for about 20% of global private investment in cyber. That came to Israel. So Israel in cyber is punching 200 times above its weight. So when you think of Israel in cyber, we're not that small country the size of New Jersey. We're bigger than a China in cyber. Now you have autonomous vehicles. You have artificial intelligence. You have all sorts of healthcare technologies. So in the technologies of the future, Israel is second to the United States. It's the second great center of innovation in the world after Silicon Valley, is what's called Silicon Wadi. This is a tremendous asset to the United States. So now take those countries, those handful of countries in security, and tell me which of those countries in technology is a better partner. So if the United States has to choose a technology partner, it won't be Britain, it won't be France, it won't be Germany, it won't be Canada, it won't be Australia, it will be Israel. So if I'm thinking which is the country in the world that's going to help keep Americans safe and prosperous, I think it's Israel. I think we become the United States' most important ally in the 21st century. It may take another decade for that to be fully understood, but I think it's going to happen. And I think here in Israel, unlike other countries in the Middle East, you don't have to choose between your interests and your values. You have both. And the final thing I'll say about it, what was unique about the relationship with Britain is that you shared a common past. I think what is unique about your relationship with Israel is that you share a common destiny, a sense of destiny that is very powerful. I mean, Israel's it's a remarkable story of this nation left for dead that comes back to life and has this future. And I think it validates in many Americans a deep sense of purpose. You know, America and Israel are not just countries, we are causes. Kissinger said about Iran, it's got to decide whether it's a country or a cause. You know, he likes countries, not causes. Has to decide whether Iran, it's a country or a cause. It is a cause, it's just a bad cause. Israel and the United States are good causes, and they stand for something. And the United States has always been this beacon of freedom for the entire world. And Israel has been this hope for the Jewish people and all of our non-Jewish citizens as well. But it's something unique, that sense of two countries that share this cause. And I think that this alliance will be held together not just because of the interests and the values. I think it's fundamentally different, America's alliance with Israel, than other countries because of this sense of destiny. And I think as long as Americans possess that sense of destiny, as long as that's inculcated, then I think that this relationship will become stronger and stronger.
Thank you.
Another short answer.
There was a very, very short and to the point. You sound like an ambassador or something. It's remarkable.
Some ambassadors don't like to talk at all. So
well,
I don't
that's true. One remarkable thing that happened in the history of this relationship was very recent. The Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There was a great uproar about this among some, and there were predictions of all sorts of awful things, including violence, which mostly didn't materialize. But can you comment on this change, and are other countries perhaps going to follow suit?
Well, as for other countries, we do have the great state of Guatemala, which followed the United States. And those of you looking for a vacation spot, by all means, go to Guatemala, because we're very positive towards them. Actually, yesterday, the Prime Minister of Australia said that he was going to consider moving it. And I think it's going to happen and it'll take time. But it was a remarkable decision that President Trump made. It's a decision that, frankly, should have been made 69 years ago. I know a lot of people focus on the peace process, but remember, the Oslo process began in '93. Jerusalem has been Israel's capital since 1949. So what happened in those 45 years? And even those who say, well, you have to have a settlement, the issue of 1967. Well, between 1949 and 1967, West Jerusalem was Israel's capital. Why didn't people move their embassies at the time? So there's always another excuse why this didn't happen. And I think it was a very important and historic decision that President Trump made. And it should have been made a long time ago, and thankfully he made it. And I think it's one of the great international decisions, or decisions by the international community, that has been made since the dawn of Zionism. The Balfour Declaration, which recognized the right of the Jews to establish a national home, is number one. Number two would be the UN Partition Resolution that called for the establishment of a Jewish state and Arab state. You know, people talk about two states for two peoples. It's not a new idea. It was in the 1947 resolution, a Jewish state and an Arab state then. And it didn't say Palestinian because then it was an Arab state. And then the third decision was Truman's decision to become the first president to recognize Israel, the newly established state of Israel. And this is the fourth decision. And I think it's a decision that will be remembered not just by Israelis, but by Jews around the world, I think forever. And we're very old people. We're 4,000-year-old people. We remember historic decisions that are made, particularly when it comes to Jerusalem. So Jews remember Cyrus, the ancient king of Persia, who, if you know your Bible, it's one of the last passages in the Bible, Cyrus enabled the Jews to go and rebuild their temple some 2,500 years ago. Now, we remember Cyrus. I don't know if Persians remember Cyrus, but Jews remember Cyrus. So this decision will be remembered for as long as the Jews are a people because of the impact and the significance of Jerusalem. As you said, it did not lead to violence. We didn't believe it was going to lead to violence, and I think that tells you something. There's a lot of times where people are constantly scared about what this or that decision is going to mean, and that the whole Middle East is going to go up in flames. That wasn't true. We didn't believe it was true, and we told the administration at the time, and we also told them that whatever happens, we're prepared to shoulder the risk. We didn't think it was going to happen, but if something did happen, we were prepared to shoulder the risk because this is our capital, and we believe it's right that Israel should be treated like every country in the world. That's the seat of our government. And our capital should be recognized. And it's also true that no matter what peace deal is put on the table, Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel. Now, there are people who think there should be a peace deal that should give the Palestinians a capital in Jerusalem, but I haven't seen a peace deal that doesn't have Jerusalem be the capital of Israel, ever. And I don't think there ever will be. So I don't think there's any reason not to do it. But the fact that he did it, I think, does one thing else that's very important, and that is it actually is a huge step forward for peace. And that's hard for people to see. Because if you think the reason why we don't have peace with the Palestinians is because we haven't found the right formula on the traditional final status issues. You know, you got Jerusalem, you got refugees, you've got territory, you've got security, and we have to find the right formula. And so people say, well, if you do this on Jerusalem, you're sort of shifting the playing field, and this is actually going to undermine the prospects for peace. But that's not why we don't have peace with the Palestinians. The reason why we don't have peace is the same reason in 1947 why the Palestinians said no to that resolution. Not just the Palestinians, then it was the Arab world. But that resolution was a Jewish state and an Arab state. There were no refugees. There were none of the settlements that existed after 1967. Jerusalem wasn't even an issue. It was an international city according to the UN resolution. There was one question. Do you recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state? Do you recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state in any boundary in our ancestral homeland? Forget about where the borders should be. Do you recognize it? And the answer was no. And there has been an attempt for the last 70 years to deny any connection between the Jewish people and this territory. And it's constant. They want to deny that connection. So Arafat said to Clinton, President Clinton at Camp David, he said there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. He said that. And Abu Mazen refuses to recognize the connection between the Jewish people and Israel and Jewish people in Jerusalem, even a historical connection. Forget about what happened in 48 or 1917 or all the issues that come up. He refuses to recognize. And you have to ask yourself, why does he refuse to recognize this connection? Because to recognize that connection would recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish people's claim to some piece of that territory. And he refuses to do it because if he does, if the Palestinian national leadership recognizes the legitimacy of our claim, then the entire edifice of their rejectionism collapses. Because what they believe and what they tell their children is a very simple story. You stole our house. You stole our land. They say that the Jews are a colonialist power in the land of Israel. We are foreign occupiers in the land of Israel. Now, those of you who don't know, we are the Jews. Why are we called Jews? Because we are the people of Judea. We are the Judeans that got shortened over time to Jews. Judea, that's our homeland. All the stories from the Bible, all of Jewish history comes from that land. By the way, it doesn't come from Tel Aviv. It comes from places like Hebron and Jerusalem. This is the land where the patriarchs of the Jewish people prayed, where our prophets preached, where our kings ruled. The Jews, it doesn't matter how many resolutions they pass at the United Nations. The Jewish people are not foreign occupiers in the land of Israel. It's ridiculous. Now, the Palestinians can say, they don't have to say, it's all your land and not ours. They can say, you have rights and we have rights. They could say it's 99% our house and 1% your house. If the Palestinians say that, we're in a negotiation. But when they say you stole our house, there's no hope. Even if you give 99.99% back, you will not be able to achieve peace. So why is that relevant for Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem? Because to recognize Jerusalem as our capital is to puncture this great lie. And it's the first time in 70 years that somebody actually punctured this lie and said, you know what? You may have a history here, you may have rights here, but the Jews also have a history. And since when King David was ruling 3,000 years ago, it was in this same city, Jerusalem. So I think the immediate aftermath is everyone thinks it's a big step backward for peace. I think what you'll see over time, and hopefully this will be the case, because hopefully we'll get a Palestinian partner that actually wants to resolve this conflict between us. I think you'll look back at this decision to recognize Jerusalem as our capital as laying a cornerstone ultimately for peace, because the only peace that's going to survive is a peace based on truth. And that decision of President Trump punctured this lie, and that's why we're deeply grateful for it. Another short answer.
Another short answer. You said earlier, quite accurately, that Churchill was a philo-Semite, and this was very rare among his class and caste and political party. His Conservative Party is now riven by all kinds of controversies and issues over Brexit. But the Labour Party in Britain seems to be eaten alive with anti-Semitism. And the crisis goes on and on and on. It's the most extraordinary thing, and millions of people are completely appalled. Can you comment on this new upsurge of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party in Britain and what Labour might do to fix the problem?
Yeah, well, that's why we have an ambassador to the UK. But yeah, he can comment on it, but I'll put it in context, and it is a huge problem. I don't want to be dismissive of it. Look, people thought that anti-Semitism had been wiped out by the Holocaust, meaning that after the Holocaust, the decades afterwards, that we would never deal with an anti-Semitism like we saw before. And I think people were looking at what happened in the decades after the Holocaust and believed that this was a new normal. And in fact, it was just an aberration. And those people who know Jewish history know that anti-Semitism is not a problem that started with the Holocaust and ended with the Holocaust. And in fact, in some way, in a deep way, the Holocaust has distorted the Jewish people's view of their own history and also non-Jewish view of Jewish history, because it is such a seismic event that happened to the Jews. It's sort of like this giant sun that blocks out all the anti-Semitic stars. You don't see it. But if you look century after century after century, take the Holocaust out of the equation. Century after century, you have mass pogroms, mass murders, persecution, discrimination against the Jews in so many different places, for so many different reasons, in so many different eras. And what you're seeing happening today, not just in Britain, which I'll get to in a second, not just in Europe, but in places like Charlottesville, and what you see is the reemergence of anti-Semitism. It used to be a couple decades ago. I actually trace it back to the Durban conference in about 2000. I think that's when it first surfaced. And you could see the demonization of Israel, the holding Israel to double standards. And what is now the problem is the old anti-Semitism is hiding behind the new anti-Semitism, which is you used to treat Jews by a different standard than they treat other peoples. Now they treat Israel to a different standard than they treat other nation on earth. But I actually see a reversion back to normalcy, the normal anti-Semitism that you've seen. So I'm not shocked by this, because I think as the Holocaust recedes from memory, I think it is no longer politically incorrect, I should say, to go after Jews. And it's certainly politically correct in many places to go after Israel, and to go after Israel with a viciousness and a venom that you don't see in many other countries. You have surveys in European countries. What's the greatest threat to the peace and security of the world? And Israel's in the top 3 in many of these nations, which is a wild thing. I don't know if people know that here, but in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I'll trace in terms of violence to about 100 years, since the early 20s. In the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 20,000 people have been killed, both Israelis and Palestinians, in the history of the conflict. Now, don't take my word for it, Google it. By the way, if you're looking at the Israeli-Arab conflict, in all of the history, you're talking about 125, 130,000. But Israelis and Palestinians, about 20,000. So, despite that, you have leading figures in the world that will compare Gaza to Auschwitz. There was a Nobel Prize winner for literature that compared Gaza to Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz, just so you know, in May 1944, they killed 10,000 Jews every day in Auschwitz. So in 2 days in May 1944, he killed more people than 100 years of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But the world is obsessed with the conflict between Israeli and Palestinians. You have 500,000 people who are killed in Syria. I found out in one of these meetings that you do as an ambassador, you meet with other ambassadors, and it's courtesy calls that other ambassadors will pay to you. And I always accept any ambassador who wants to meet with me. I'll always sort of meet with them, and they usually you get sort of 10 ambassadors that you choose to meet when you first arrive. And anytime somebody wants to meet with Israel, I always want to meet with them. And it also, by the way, it saves you a lot of time, because if it's a smart ambassador, it saves you about 5 years of reading The Economist, if they're smart. And a lot of people are pretty smart there. So one day I got a visit from the ambassador of Burundi. He came to see me, who asked to meet with me. And it was one of those rare days, this will surprise all of you, particularly here tonight, that I was actually tired of listening to myself speak. It doesn't happen to me all the time, but I was tired of it. And I didn't want to speak about Iran, and I didn't want to speak about the peace process, and I didn't want to talk about all the problems, and I know nothing about Burundi. So I have the ambassador of Burundi there, and I start asking him questions about Burundi, about what do they do there, what do they make there, what do they export, what do they import, all of the issues that Burundi has. And I said, do you have a security problem? He says to me, not since 2004. So I said, well, what happened in 2004? And he starts explaining to me that you had this terrible genocide in Rwanda in 1994, about 900,000 people who were killed in 3 months. It's an unbelievable number. And it spilled over into Burundi, and they had violence there for a decade. And so he's telling me the story. He said in 2004, they had some sort of peace process, some sort of ceasefire, and they haven't had a security problem since then. I said, so how many people died in that decade? He said 300,000. 300,000. Then I asked him the question, how many people you think have died in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And he said 2 million. And I said he was only off by a couple of zeros, because it's 20,000. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I don't want to be hard on him, because I don't know anything about Burundi. Maybe he just doesn't know anything about Israel. So I started asking other ambassadors. I didn't find a single ambassador in this town who thinks that there's less than 250,000 Israelis and Palestinians who've been killed in the last century, a single one. And one person insisted that I was wrong, because he was the Middle East director of I'm not going to say who it was, of a Middle East foreign ministry. In his foreign ministry, he was the director of the Middle East. He says, no, that can't be right. And I said, well, you used to have to go to be a scholar. You used to have to go and sit in the Library of Alexandria and go through all these old scrolls. Now you just take out your phone and Google it and see if I'm right. And the reason why I say that is because this obsession with Israel, the demonization of Israel, the wild allegations against Israel, this is very much like the old anti-Semitism that we had in the past. And so I don't think it's not something new, it's just an old anti-Semitism with a brand new face. And I think in Britain, what you have in the Labour Party is deeply disturbing. And what you have from Mr. Corbyn, I mean, anything that I don't know, I want to be diplomatic about it, but the man seems to me to be an anti-Semite from everything that I'm seeing and reading. I mean, he has an obsession with Israel that is more than other people who are in his party. And that should be a serious concern. There are two things that give me reason for hope. Number one is the Jews in Britain are standing up. And that historically for Jews in Britain to do that and to come forward and to confront this is actually quite rare. And I think it shows you that they understand that this is a deep problem that needs to be confronted early. And the second thing is there's an Israel, which is a big difference than what we had 75 years ago. Because the founders of Zionism, I spoke about Herzl before, many of them believed that the birth of Israel the reestablishment of a Jewish state would mean the end of anti-Semitism, because their understanding of anti-Semitism, they say there's Jews are a minority everywhere. And that's why there's anti-Semitism. If we have one country where we're a majority, then we are going to be treated like every other people. And they were convinced that if they would establish a Jewish state, anti-Semitism would wither away. And the irony is that now anti-Semitism has come full circle. Because in Herzl's day, they believed that the reason why there's anti-Semitism is that the Jews do not have a state. Now people believe the reason why there's anti-Semitism is that the Jews do have a state. Then they said 100 years ago, the signs were Jews go to Palestine. Now the signs are Jews get out of Palestine. So Israel is not the cure or the cause of anti-Semitism. But Israel fundamentally transformed the condition of the Jewish people because it gave the Jewish people the ability to fight back. That's the difference. So you have this old anti-Semitism, but we're no longer a stateless, powerless, voiceless people that can't defend itself. So we can defend ourselves on the battlefield, and we unfortunately have to, but we can also defend ourselves in the courts of public opinion by calling out people for being anti-Semites and for confronting them, and hopefully those governments will protect their Jewish populations against anti-Semitism, and people of goodwill, Jews and non-Jews, will stand up to anti-Semites. It should never be politically correct to be an anti-Semite. You don't want to live in a world where that's acceptable. And I think it's a real problem, it's a growing problem, and it should be nipped in the bud.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
I'm very comfortable in my chair, by the way.
Oh, I'm glad you like it.
I'm happy to see it.
Yeah, we could get you an extra one if you want.
Did you get that on tape, that he's going to get me one of these chairs? Yeah.
It really was a good bargain. Before I ask these questions from our audience, I just wanted to ask that when we are finished, that everybody stay in their seats until the ambassador and his team depart. This is, I think, a very good question. In a room like this, with a lot of young people, I think possibly a lot of aspiring diplomats, you hold your country's most important diplomatic post. What's your advice, is this question, what's your advice for GW students interested in diplomacy and international relations as a career?
That's a good question. Well, the first thing I'd say is, I say this to everybody, no matter what they're going to do, is to do something you love. Because if you do something that you love to do, you'll be very good at it. So if you're studying international relations and diplomacy and that's when you love, great. Keep doing it and you'll be very good at it. If you don't love it and you're doing it because other people want you to do it or it sounds prestigious, don't. That's the first thing. So do whatever it is you're going to do something that you love, you'll be very good at it. It may take you longer to achieve something. You might go through a period where your friends don't like it because of what it says on your resume. It doesn't matter. You'll be great at things that you love. The second piece of advice is to find a mentor and to work with somebody who you, or for somebody who you respect and you can learn a lot from. And I was very blessed to have worked for two people. First, Natan Sharansky, this famous the greatest Jewish dissident of the former Soviet Union, from a young age of 25, after I graduated Oxford, actually before, I was working for him when he entered Israeli politics. He had been 9 years in a Soviet prison, and then he came to Israel and got into politics. I told him the first time I met him, it would be interesting to work for you because usually people first go into politics and then go to prison, and he was actually reversing the order. And then I was able to work, and I've worked for Benjamin Netanyahu for 18 years. And the amount that you learn in 1 year that I can learn from him is more than a decade working for someone else. So if you have the opportunity, whatever position that you're going to take, don't focus on the money, particularly early on in your career. Find somebody who you believe in, who you want to work for, and go there, because you'll learn a lot from them. And the last thing I'd say is to have pride in what you're doing and to be a perfectionist about it. I remember one time I came to the Prime Minister, I had prepared a speech. He's a tough editor. But I walked into the Prime Minister's office, I think the first year I was there, and I'd already been with him in one capacity or another for a decade, and I walked in with this speech I gave him. He says, you know what your problem is? You can write a better speech than anyone in Israel. I said, oh, that's my problem. It's not good enough. Meaning you have to compete with yourself. Don't stop trying to improve. Don't stop trying to make the work as good as possible. Eventually you run out of time. I say the poem is done when the poet gives up. Netanyahu, when he goes to speak at the UN or Congress, and Churchill was, by the way, the exact same thing. He was changing his speech on the way to the podium because he always had to find that exact word. Netanyahu is the exact same way. We never give a speech early to anybody. So the media never gets Netanyahu's speech before, and it's not just the element of surprise. He's not done with it yet. A lot of times I'd be the only person who'll know the change that he made on the podium because he wants to perfect it. Ultimately, you run out of time. But I think whatever you're going to do, whatever position you have, excel, try to be the best at that. And I think people who, not everybody will see it, but the people who matter will see it. And they'll recognize it, and I think that's how you'll end up moving. Rather than sort of planning out a whole path, just be very good at what you're doing, love what you're doing, get with the right people, and then let the rest take care of itself.
Thank you. We'll just do two more quick ones, I think. What is the importance of the new nation-state law? How do you respond to criticism of it?
So, just for those of you who don't know, Israel a few weeks ago passed a bill that declares Israel the nation state for the Jewish people, and it has a number of different elements in that bill. Now, I think a lot of the critics, frankly, don't understand the law and didn't read the law. So those of you who are critical of the law should just pull it up online. Again, it's all public information, and should read the bill. There's nothing in it that anyone should be concerned with. Here's the problem that people have. They don't understand the difference between an individual right and a collective right. In Israel, all of our citizens are equal as individuals before the law. Jews do not have rights that non-Jews don't have. So whether you're Jewish or Arab or Druze or Circassian, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't matter. You have the exact same individual rights in Israel. But Israel is also the one place where the Jewish people exercise a collective right of self-determination. Self-determination is not an individual right, it's a collective right. It gives nations the right to define themselves. Those in the 19th century was a very important concept, and even in the beginning of the 20th century, that nations should have the right to self-determination. Now, it's sometimes hard for Americans to understand this because America is not a nation state in the traditional sense of the word. So there's no collective rights, everybody just has the same individual rights. But when you hear that Israel's the Jewish state, it means that Israel's the one place where the Jewish people exercise a collective national right of self-determination. And what's the practical impact of that? What we have in Israel, perhaps the most important law that we have in Israel, is called the law of return. And the law of return enables Jews, actually the grandchildren of Jews, not just the children, but the grandchildren of Jews, to go to Israel and to automatically become citizens of the country. As long as you can prove you're a grandchild of a Jew, you qualify automatically. It doesn't matter if we like you, don't like you, you automatically can become a citizen based on that law. Well, that's because Israel's the nation state of the Jewish people. That's why that's unique to Israel. We also have a Druze population in Israel, and some of them have families on the other side of a fence with Syria or some other country. You have Palestinians or Israeli Arabs who would have family, extended family on the other side. They don't have an automatic right of citizenship. They go through a different citizenship process, which would be the same citizenship process that you'd have in most countries, but they don't have an automatic right. And what had happened in Israel, and this is also a little bit in the details, but what had happened in Israel, we had passed certain basic laws. Israel, for those of you who don't know, does not have a written constitution. We have some basic laws. Most of our basic laws deal with issues like administrative issues of the branches of government and what the various powers are. But we also had a basic law passed in Israel that dealt with the democracy side of Israel's a democracy and a Jewish state. So we passed basic law that dealt with the democracy and equality side of the equation. And what this law was doing was anchoring the other side of the equation, that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, that yes, Jews have a right to immigrate. And so a lot of the criticism that came is simply not understanding how important it was for Israel as a constitutional matter to anchor both of those principles. And Israel will remain a democracy just like it was before. No one's individual rights, the individual rights of no Israelis will be denigrated by this at all. But Israel will be and will remain, it has been and will remain as a constitutional matter, the nation state of the Jewish people. And I don't think it's anything that Israel needs to apologize about or feel badly about. I think actually in the treatment of Israel, it's very much like I said before, where Israel is held to a completely different standard than other countries. One of the issues that they raised when it came to the nation state bill was the issue of Arabic, is the status of Arabic. So we didn't have an official status. There was no constitutional status because none of these issues were addressed by the Constitution. Israel made Hebrew the official language. Now, you have 30 American states where English is the official language. I don't think that that necessarily denigrates the rights of other people. It doesn't say it's English only. It say English is the official language. Not only that, we had in this bill said that nothing can be done to denigrate, as a matter of practice, the Arabic language. So Arabic was given special status in Israel as a constitutional matter. So the nation state of the Jewish people declared a special status for Arabic, official status for Hebrew. Now, there's 100 countries in the United Nations, 100, over 100, where they only have one official language. And many of those countries have minorities who speak other language. There are over 50 countries that either have a cross or a crescent on their flag. Over 50. And Israel has the Star of David on its flag. And there's dozens of countries that are nation states in the traditional sense, even though there are other peoples and minorities who live there. None of those countries are accused of racism. None of those countries are accused of apartheid. None of those countries are demonized. Only Israel is demonized. So it either comes from a lack of understanding, or the criticism comes from a desire to cast Israel as some force for evil in the world. And that's a very, very old phenomenon.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm afraid that we are out of time, but before we depart, let me invite all of you to join us on Monday, November 5th for the launch of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, the brilliant new biography of Churchill by our mutual friend, Andrew Roberts. That's here at the NCLC at 6 p.m. on Monday, November 5th. We hope to see you here. Please remain in your seats until the Ambassador departs.
And it's a 900-page volume, so it's not only a walk with destiny, it's a long walk.
It's a long walk with destiny.
But I highly recommend it, and thank you very much.
It's really superb. Thanks, Ambassador.